The boy sat in the last row of folding chairs, alone, holding a paper plate with a slice of untouched graduation cake, while 300 guests celebrated around him as if he were furniture. He wasn't crying, that was the part that stayed with people who noticed him. And almost nobody did. He was just sitting there with the kind of stillness that takes years to learn, the kind that means you've already practiced being invisible long enough that you've gotten good at it. His cap was slightly crooked, his gown was a size too large, and every few seconds, his eyes would drift toward the main entrance of the banquet hall, searching for a face that wasn't coming. His name was Cooper Aldane. He was 11 years old, and he had just graduated from 5th grade, which in his school meant a ceremony, a catered reception at the Riverside Community Center, a balloon arch, a cake with blue and gold frosting, and 100 photographs being taken of children surrounded by smiling families. Cooper had none of those things. What he had was a paper plate, a plastic fork, and a father who was 45 minutes late because of a shift change at the hospital that nobody had told him about until that morning. The father's name was Brendan Aldane. And the thing you need to understand about Brendan, the thing that matters for everything that comes after, is that he was trying. He had been trying, every single day, for 3 years, with the particular desperation of a man who knows exactly what he has to lose and is terrified he's already losing it. Brendan had been a respiratory therapist at St. Augustine Medical Center for 14 years. He was good at his job in the quiet, reliable way that nobody writes articles about. The kind of good that shows up in the fact that his patients remembered his name, that the night nurses saved him the easier IV line, that the attending physicians trusted his read on a patient's breathing before they trusted the monitors. He was not flashy. He was not ambitious in the climbing sense. He had built a small decent life in Millhaven, Ohio, and for 11 years, that life had included his wife, Denise. Denise had died of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday in March, 3 years before Cooper's graduation. She was 38. She had been making breakfast when it happened. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, the coffee already poured, and Cooper had been the one who found her when he came downstairs. He was 8 years old. He had been old enough to understand what he was seeing, and young enough that it would live inside him forever. Brendan did not fall apart, because he could not afford to. Cooper needed him too completely. So instead of falling apart, Brendan compressed. He became very efficient and very tired. He went back to work after 2 weeks, because they needed the income, and because sitting in the house alone while Cooper was at school was a particular kind of unbearable. He didn't have language for yet. He packed lunches every morning. He drove Cooper to school and picked him up. He showed up for parent-teacher conferences and dentist appointments, and the one disastrous season of Little League that Cooper quit after 4 games, and he did not complain about any of it, because complaining implied there was someone to complain to. He had requested the day of the graduation off 6 weeks in advance. His supervisor had approved it. What nobody anticipated was that Marcus, the therapist who was supposed to cover the morning shift, would call in sick with an ear infection, and that the department was short-staffed because 2 people were on vacation, and that Brendan would get a call at 7:15 that morning, asking if he could come in for just a few hours, just until noon, and Brendan had said yes, because he always said yes, and then noon had become 1 o'clock, and the ceremony had started at 11, and by the time Brendan walked through the doors of the Riverside Community Center, at 12:47, the graduation processional was long over and the reception was halfway through. He spotted Cooper immediately. Partly because he knew his son's posture the way you know a song you've heard 1,000 times, and partly because Cooper was the only child in the room sitting alone. What Brendan did not know, as he stood in the doorway scanning the room, was that someone else had already noticed. His name was Floyd Mercer. He was 62 years old, recently retired from 30 years as a high school football coach in a small town in western Kentucky, and he was at the Riverside Community Center that afternoon, because his granddaughter Abigail was among the graduating 5th graders. Floyd was the kind of man who took up exactly the amount of space he was given and no more. He was broad-shouldered, in the way of men who were once athletic and have gone soft around the edges, without losing the underlying structure. He had big hands, and a quiet way of moving through a room and a habit One his wife had pointed out to him dozens of times over 40 years of marriage. Of watching people at the edges of gatherings rather than the center. Floyd had spent 3 decades watching young people. He knew the difference between a kid who was fine and a kid who was performing fine. Cooper Aldane was performing fine. The paper plate, the untouched cake, the way his eyes kept moving to the door. Floyd had seen that particular combination before, in locker rooms after losses, in hallways after bad test scores, in the faces of kids who had decided, not consciously, not in words, that they were the kind of person things didn't work out for. Floyd's granddaughter Abigail was across the room, surrounded by her parents and both sets of grandparents, and what appeared to be several aunts. She was fine, more than fine. She was luminous in the way of 11-year-old girls who are surrounded by people who love them, bouncing on her heels, and eating 2 pieces of cake simultaneously. Floyd set down his own plate, and walked over to the last row of chairs. He sat down next to Cooper without asking for permission, which was a calculated choice. He'd learned over the decades that asking kids if they wanted company often gave them the opportunity to say no, when what they actually wanted was yes. So instead he just sat, and he looked at Cooper's cake, and he said in his easy Kentucky drawl, that the chocolate or the vanilla. Cooper looked at him. There was a pause, the kind where a kid is deciding whether a grown-up is safe. Chocolate, Cooper said. Good choice, Floyd said. The vanilla's got that weird almond aftertaste. Taste like sunscreen. He picked up his fork. You graduate today? Cooper nodded. 6th grade next year? Yeah. That's a big deal. Floyd said it simply, without the performative enthusiasm adults often use with children, which made it land differently. It landed like he meant it. You nervous about it? Cooper considered this. A little. That's smart, Floyd said. Nervous means you care. The kids who aren't nervous are usually the ones who aren't paying attention. He glanced around the room. Your family here? There was a long pause. Long enough that Floyd didn't fill it. My dad's coming, Cooper said finally. He got held up at work. What does he do? He's a respiratory therapist. Floyd raised his eyebrows. That's serious work. Something shifted in Cooper's face. Not much, just enough. He helps people breathe, Cooper said, and there was a quiet pride in it that Floyd recognized. The pride of a kid who has spent time thinking about what his parent does and has decided it matters. That's about as important as it gets, Floyd said. They sat together for a moment, not uncomfortably. Cooper picked up his fork and took a bite of the chocolate cake. Is it good? Floyd asked. Cooper thought about it with the seriousness the question deserved. Better than I expected, he said. Floyd laughed. It was a real laugh, not a performance. Story of most things, he said. By the time Brendan came through the door, Cooper was in the middle of explaining, with considerable animation, the difference between how his school's graduation ceremony was organized, versus how Abigail's class had organized theirs, which he had heard about secondhand from a girl in his homeroom, whose cousin went to that school. Floyd was listening with genuine attention, asking follow-up questions, and had, without making any production of it, signaled to his daughter across the room that he was staying where he was for the moment. Brendan stopped when he saw his son talking. Not just talking the way Cooper almost never talked with adults, with his hands moving and his posture loose and his face doing all the things it didn't do when Cooper was being quiet and careful and self-contained. Brendan stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to. He pressed the back of his hand briefly to his mouth, then he composed himself and walked over. Hey bud, he said. His voice was controlled, but just barely. Cooper looked up. There was a flicker of something complicated, not quite hurt, not quite relief, something that held both. Hey Dad, I'm sorry I'm late, Brendan said. He said it simply, without excuses, which was how he always apologized. Cooper had noticed this about his father years ago, the way he didn't wrap apologies in reasons the way some adults did, as if the reason made the apology smaller. It's okay, Cooper said. It's not, Brendan said, but we'll talk about it later. He looked at Floyd and extended his hand. Brendan Aldane, Floyd Mercer, Floyd said, standing to shake it. My granddaughter's in Cooper's class, Abigail. The one who apparently organized the whole graduation slideshow. She's really good at that stuff, Cooper said, with a generosity Brendan recognized as genuine, which was one of the things about his son that amazed him. The lack of bitterness in Cooper, despite everything. You have a good kid, Floyd said to Brendan. Brendan looked at Cooper, Something passed between them that was too private to name. Yeah, Preston said, I know, they didn't stay much longer. Brendan got Cooper a second slice of cake, and stood beside him, while Cooper introduced him to 3 of his classmates, who drifted over, and then to Abigail, who was exactly as confident and cheerful as advertised, and who told Brendan with great earnestness that Cooper had helped her fix a math error in the graduation program the week before, and that she owed him one. Brendan listened to all of this and said the right things, and then, when Cooper was ready, they said goodbye to Floyd, who gave Cooper a handshake that turned into a brief, firm grip and said, "6th grade is going to be good. I mean that." Cooper looked at him. "How do you know?" "I don't," Floyd said, "but I've watched a lot of kids, and the good ones figure out how to make it good. You're one of the good ones." Cooper was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Thanks, Mr. Mercer." They walked out to the parking lot together, Brendan and Cooper, and when they got to the car, Cooper stood by the passenger door for a second without getting in. "You okay?" Brendan asked. "Yeah," Cooper said. "Then I know it wasn't your fault. The work thing." Brendan looked at his son across the roof of the car. The afternoon light was doing something golden and specific, the kind that happens in Ohio in late May, and Cooper's graduation cap was still slightly crooked, and Brendan thought about Denise, the way he always did in moments like this. The way he would always, he suspected, think about Denise, and he said, "I should have been there from the beginning." "But you came," Cooper said, simply without drama. "You always come." That night, after Cooper was asleep, Brendan sat at the kitchen table, with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, and thought about what his son had said, and about the man named Floyd, who had sat down next to his kid in a room full of people, and simply chosen to stay. He thought about the version of the afternoon he'd been dreading on the drive over. Cooper alone, hurt, withdrawn, that particular quiet he retreated into when things were hard, the one that took days to come out of. He thought about what he'd seen instead, his son's hands moving, his face animated, his posture loose. A stranger had done that. Someone with no obligation whatsoever, someone whose granddaughter was surrounded by family across the room, someone who could have easily, stayed where he was, and no one would have faulted him for it. Floyd Mercer had looked at a boy sitting alone, and had decided, without fanfare, that it was not acceptable for that to continue. Brendan didn't know Floyd's story. He didn't know about the 30 years of coaching, or the way Floyd had made it a practice over decades, to find the kid at the edge of the huddle. The one who showed up every day, but never quite believed he belonged. The one Floyd called the ones who just need someone to tell them they're already in. Brendan didn't know any of that. What he knew was the look on his son's face, and that was enough. The summer after Cooper's graduation was not a turning point in any dramatic sense. Life didn't reorganize itself around a single afternoon. Bills were still tight, Brendan still worked long shifts. Cooper still had the quiet, careful quality of a kid who had learned to take up less space than he needed. But things shifted, the way things shift when something small changes the angle of everything. Brendan started taking Sundays off with more intention. Not always. The hospital was unpredictable, but more than before. He and Cooper started going to the farmers' market on Millhaven's main square, something Denise had loved, something they had both avoided since she died because it was too full of her. They went anyway now. The first time was uncomfortable. The second time was less so. By the fourth time, Cooper had discovered a stall that sold garlic cheddar bread, and treated the discovery with the reverence it deserved. Brendan also called in a favor with his scheduling coordinator, and arranged that, for the next school year, he would not be on call for any of Cooper's school events, unless there was a genuine emergency. His coordinator had looked at him with an expression Brendan couldn't quite read, and then said, "Brendan, you could have asked for that years ago." And Brendan had not had a good answer for that, so he'd just said, "Yeah," and gone back to work. Cooper started 6th grade in September. He was nervous, the way he'd told Floyd he would be, and he was also paying attention, which Floyd had said was the smart response to being nervous. He made one close friend in the first month, a quiet kid named. Cooper insisted on telling his father the full name with great solemnity. Tobias Keene, who was obsessed with marine biology in a way that Cooper found both baffling and genuinely interesting, and who thought Cooper's knowledge of hospital equipment was, and Cooper quoted him directly, "legitimately the coolest thing I've ever heard." Brendan heard this at dinner and made a mental note to text Tobias's father, which he did the next morning. They ended up talking for 20 minutes. His name was Dale Keene. He was also, it turned out, navigating single parenthood, for different reasons. A difficult divorce rather than a death. And while the situations were not the same, there was enough common ground that the conversation ended with plans for a cookout the following weekend. Those plans actually happened, which in Brendan's experience was rarer than it should be. Floyd Mercer texted in late September. He had gotten Brendan's number from Abigail's mother, he explained, and hoped it wasn't too forward. He was just checking in, seizing how the school year was going. Brendan read the text twice before responding, because it had been a long time since someone outside of work or Cooper's school had simply checked in. He wrote back, "Good so far. Cooper made a friend. Kids obsessed with sharks," and then, after a moment, "Thank you for sitting with him. I think about it more than I probably should." Floyd wrote back, "Don't overthink it, just sat down. Sometimes that's the whole job." Brendan stared at that for a while. Sometimes that's the whole job. He thought about that sentence at work the next week, when he noticed a new patient in the pulmonology ward. A man in his late 60s, recovering from pneumonia, whose room was always empty when Brendan came in. No visitors, no get-well cards. A single photograph on the bedside table, turned slightly away from the door. So you couldn't quite see who was in it. The man's name was Everett Tull, and he was technically doing well. His numbers improving, his oxygen levels stabilizing. But he had the look of a person whose recovery was going to outlast his will to bother with it. On his third visit, Brendan finished his chart notes, and then, instead of moving on to the next room, he sat down in the chair by Everett's bed and said, "The food here is famously bad, but I heard the pudding on Thursdays is acceptable. You tried it yet?" Everett looked at him with the mild suspicion of a man unaccustomed to being spoken to. "The chocolate one? That's the one." Pause. "It's decent," Everett said, with the careful admission of a person who doesn't want to be too enthusiastic about anything. "High praise," Brendan said. "Around here, decent is basically a 5-star review." Everett's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something earlier than a smile. "You're the breathing one," he said. "Respiratory therapist." "Yeah, that's me." "You're good at it," Everett said. "Most of them rush in and out. You actually..." He stopped. "What?" "You actually talk to me like I'm a person," Everett said. With the faint embarrassment of someone saying something they didn't mean to say out loud. Brendan sat with that for a second. He thought about Floyd Mercer sitting down in the last row of chairs without asking for permission. He thought about Cooper's hands moving, the animation in his face, the way he'd said you always come across the roof of the car in that gold May light. "You are a person," Brendan said. "That seems like a reasonable starting point." Everett looked at him. Something shifted. "Yeah," Everett said. "I guess it does. There is something particular about the courage of ordinary moments, not the dramatic interventions, not the grand gestures, not the GoFundMe campaigns, and the viral videos and the stories that get shared a million times, because they have the satisfying shape of a story. But the unremarkable ones. The man who sits down next to the kid with the crooked cap. The father who drives 45 minutes over the speed limit and doesn't make excuses. The respiratory therapist who pulls up a chair. These are not stories that get told at funerals or featured in magazines. They don't have a clean ending where everyone is healed. What they have is the next day, and the day after that, and the accumulation of small choices to stay present in a world that makes absence very easy. Cooper Aldane turned 12 in January. Brendan took the day off, a full day, scheduled 3 months in advance, with 2 backup arrangements in case something came up. He and Cooper drove 2 hours to Cleveland, to see the Natural History Museum, because Cooper had expressed vague interest in it once, 8 months earlier, and Brendan had written it down on a post-it note, and stuck it to the refrigerator. Cooper noticed that, walking into the museum, he didn't say anything, but he noticed. They spent 4 hours there. Cooper was interested in everything, with the particular intensity of a kid, who has learned not to express enthusiasm too loudly, and is still learning to unlearn that. He stopped longest in front of a display about the deep ocean, pressure, darkness, creatures that generate their own light, and read every single placard, while Brendan stood beside him and read them too, and asked questions that were genuinely curious, not performed. At some point, Cooper said, without looking up from the display, Tobias would lose his mind in here. We should bring him, Brendan said. Cooper looked at him. Yeah, call his dad, we'll make a day of it. Cooper turned back to the display, but he was smiling. The real kind. The kind that Brendan could still find, after everything, after all the years of careful quiet, the kind that was unmistakably Denise. He didn't say that. He just stood next to his son in the blue light of the deep ocean exhibit, and read about creatures that lived in the dark, and had learned to make their own light, and thought that there were worse metaphors in the world, and let it be. Floyd Mercer came to Millhaven once, in March, to visit Abigail for spring break. He texted Brendan, and Brendan invited him for coffee, and Floyd showed up at the kitchen table on a Saturday morning, and drank 2 cups and talked with Cooper about 6th grade, and Tobias, and the deep ocean display for the better part of an hour. He asked Cooper if he'd thought about what he wanted to do. Eventually, Cooper said he didn't know. Floyd said that was fine. He said he'd known 100 kids who'd been certain at 12 and hadn't done any of it, and 100 kids who'd had no idea and it turned out extraordinarily well. The ones who do okay, Floyd said, are usually the ones who stay curious. And you're curious. He said it the same way he'd said everything. Simply, without inflation, as if it were a fact he was reporting rather than a compliment he was giving. Cooper looked at him. You said that at graduation, that I was one of the good ones. I remember, Floyd said. I've been thinking about it, Cooper said. What made you say that? Floyd thought about it seriously, the way the question deserved. You weren't performing, he said. You were just sitting there, not putting on a show, not pretending to be fine, not acting like you didn't care. You were just being honest about what was happening. He paused. That takes more guts than most people realize, especially at your age. Cooper was quiet for a moment, then he said, I didn't feel like I had guts, I just didn't know what else to do. Yeah, Floyd said. That's usually what it looks like. After Floyd left, Cooper helped Brendan wash the mugs, which was not a thing he always did voluntarily, and then he stood at the sink for a moment before saying, I like him. Yeah, Brendan said. Me too, he seems like the kind of person who paid attention, Cooper said, like his whole life, to things. Brendan handed him the dish towel. I think that's exactly right. Cooper dried the mugs and put them in the cabinet. I want to be like that, he said, not dramatically, just as a statement of intention, the way you'd say I want to get better at math or I want to learn to cook something that isn't pasta. Brendan didn't make a big thing of it. He just said, I think you already are. If there is a lesson in all of this, and there is one, though it resists being made into a poster, it is not about grand gestures, it is not about extraordinary people doing extraordinary things. It is about a retired football coach, who looked up from his cake, and noticed a boy sitting alone, and decided that noticing was not enough, that you had to do something with the noticing. It is about a father who showed up 45 minutes late and apologized without excuses, and kept showing up. It is about a boy who sat in the last row of chairs with an untouched plate, and did not pretend to be fine, and waited, with the particular faith of someone who has been waiting long enough to be good at it, for something to change. And the thing that changed was small. It was always going to be small. One person pulling up a chair, one question asked in a Kentucky drawl, about chocolate versus vanilla. One sentence that stayed with a man long after the conversation was over. Sometimes that's the whole job. There are people in your life right now, maybe in your family, maybe in your neighborhood, maybe sitting 3 rows over at some event, you're only half paying attention to, who are holding a paper plate and a plastic fork and waiting for someone to sit down. They are not going to announce themselves. They are not going to wave. They have already gotten good at being still. The only question is whether you'll look up.